person that you might have worked with previously, or you know, thinking about how you might be able to apply this to your context would be really interesting to talk about at the end.
Yeah, we're happy to take questions on that. So often often the way systems work at the minute is that we put the problem on the child. And so when we think about children that are in distress, we often observe the child. The referral that comes in is for a specific child, a problem that's occurring in their behaviour or the way they are, or something like that. And it's the child that's referred to be fixed. And we often ask, we often hear people say, something wrong with my child, or they're asking, what's wrong with my child? Why are they behaving like this? Is there something wrong with them? Have they got an ASD? Have they got another kind of diagnosis? But what we want to start with is giving some of the evidence base and some of the thinking around what's underneath that, and talking to children's distress and making a case for children's distress as normal reactions to adverse circumstances. So we're going to start with going through some of that thinking. Anything to add, Kieran?
Yeah, just to say that, you know, like you said, we often put the problem on the child, but actually it could be things like family conflict, relationship conflict, couple conflict. It could be ACEs, it could be parental mental health, you know, addiction. So lots of looking at what's underneath behaviour is really important. And I just wanted to give a nod to this image because it's really powerful image, kind of showing really that, you know, when parents are troubled, that, you know, they could shout, they can humiliate, they can constantly criticize a child, and that has a real impact on their sense of who they are. And I think a lot of people say, but children are resilient. But I think they're quite wrong, because actually we often assume resilience when the child's brain is at its most vulnerable. So after, you know, it's still forming, the brain is still making those neuro pathways. So it's really important to understand, kind of like thinking about how chronic stress can have an impact then on the system.
We're certain that ACES Hub have done their job, and that lots of people have heard of ACES, and that you've maybe done the ACES training. So we just wanted to give a nod to that. That's what we're talking about here, like Kieran was just saying. But for those that haven't, or just to remind you for this, to hold this point in mind whilst we're going through this, that the evidence base really strongly shows the relationship between adverse childhood and community experiences and our emotional and physical health as children, but especially as adults. So there is a clear correlation, although it's not always direct. It's not like cause and effect. There are many different things that interact, but there is a link between what you experience in your childhood and adult mental health and adult physical health. It's not a like done deal, but there is definitely a link, and we need to be thinking about that link. So often when we think about mental health, we think about diagnosis and we think about disorders, but actually following on from the ACES research and what the evidence base is telling us is that we need to dig deeper, and that actually there isn't a strong evidence base for the medical model, and there isn't a strong evidence base then for the majority of mental health diagnoses, or where we have diagnoses, we don't have a clear understanding of why they are the way they are. And actually, what the evidence alongside adverse childhood experiences and adverse community experiences is showing us, what the evidence for the social determinants of health and health inequity, what that's showing us is that we need to dig deeper, and it's about more than just, it's not about what's internal to us, it's about a very many broad range of things that exist in our environments. And this diagram indicates what some of those things are, but in summary, if we want to understand mental health, what we need to start thinking about, mental health as about our circumstances, and we need to start exploring more broadly about what's happened to us. So there is there has not been to date strong evidence to validate things like the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the DSM, or the ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases books, which are where the diagnoses that you get in mental health are all labelled and listed. We've not got strong evidence that those are the correct ways of interpreting mental health. But what we have seen, what we see from the social determinants of health research, is that the vast majority of our outcome related to mental health comes from our social environment. So I think it's about 10% of our health outcomes are associated with access to healthcare, which means this is more than about just access to one-to-one therapy or access to mental health services, because about 80%, and it's great because of the way epigenetics plays out, so not genetics. There's no genes that have been shown to be the causes of mental health problems. The chemical imbalance theory has not shown to have validity, but what we have seen is that 80% is associated with things like housing, access to secure employment, access to education, access to food, and access to kind of like psychologically healthy environments. So just quickly, the model that we use to understand this is, as you can see on the side by here, so the stuff that's playing out in our psychology of all this stuff down here: poverty, oppression, racism, injustice. The things that link it to our psychological well-being is if we're having, and if you think about ACEs here, if we have prolonged chronic exposure to things like humiliation, shame, isolation, fear, loneliness, and feeling trapped and powerless, our mental health is compromised, and we can see that. You can see that across the populations. And so what we need to be thinking about, what the antithesis of that is, creating psychologically healthy environments that are based on agency, security, connection, meaning, and trust. And that's at the individual level. So when we're thinking about working with individuals, with a child, with a family, that we're thinking about what's their experience of humiliation, shame, etc., and how do we help them move towards having more positive, psychologically healthy experiences. But this is true of all the different layers of the system, so of our school environments, our work environments, of our policy, and etc. It all has to be there. Anything to add, Kieran?
Just an example really, Jen. So like, you know, I'm working at the moment with a group of young people who identify themselves within the kind of LGBTQ plus kind of group, and they experience a lot of discrimination at school, especially around using toilets and PE and getting changed. And I've been doing a lot of work about discrimination and the impact, and how do we cope, and how can we speak out to the school about this and call it out, but in a safe way. And you know, thinking about the difference between belonging and fitting in. And I think that when you're within that kind of group, it's difficult to speak out. So it's about how can we help people think about discrimination in a different way.
Yeah, and that's true for things like anxiety and depression, but it's also true for psychosis, eating disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar. It's true of those things as well. And what we see is there's a direct correlation between those that are in the bottom 20% of the population are 9 times, in terms of economic distribution, are 9 times more likely to receive a diagnosis of psychosis, 3 or 4 times more likely to receive a diagnosis of anxiety or depression, compared to those at the top 20% of the economic distribution. And so if you think about how oppression manifests across society, there is a correlation with mental health. And so we really need to be thinking about this, not just for anxiety and depression, but across the mental health severity span. So in summary, what we're saying is our mental health is determined by where we are born, where we grow, where we work, where we live, where we age, and the wider set of like policies and practices and cultures, and how resources are shared across our lifespan, across a across our lives. And I think perhaps thinking about COVID and thinking about your own experience of your own circumstances and how that's impacting you. So maybe if you've been homeschooling like I have, you may be definitely feeling it, in that the changes in your own circumstances have impacted on how you're feeling and your own mental health. It's a nice shared, I think, example of how some of this stuff plays out more chronically then, if you can imagine that. So what we're saying is mental health is not about what's wrong with you, it's about what's happened to you. Anything to add, Kieran? So we use this model, the ecological model, to help us like make sense of that and frame it. So it's really, so thinking about those families that you've got in your mind, so start to think about what are their circumstances like and what are their circumstances across these different layers. Kieran, did you want to talk to this, if I would?
Yes, so like this is the Bromford-Brenner model, and it's an ecological systems theory which focuses on the quality and context of the child's environment, and the way that he's kind of organised it is in the order of how much impact they have on the child. And it's divided into like 4 different systems, so they're quite big words: microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem and macrosystem.
We've decoded them on the other side. So we're talking about the child, your immediate family, your friends, your community, your connections, your formal network, services and environment, and then wider society.
Yeah, and so I think the ones that we see in practice a lot is that kind of immediate environment then, so thinking about kind of the family system, but then also the connections to community and school, and if a parent and the child's relationship is struggling because a parent is kind of got is isolated and there's lots of instability around kind of zero contract hours, bedroom tax, you know, all of these things where benefits might have been cut, then that's going to have a detrimental impact on their mental health, but also that kind of fear of like, feeling helplessness because they can't give children what they want. And so it's that kind of toxic stress and that impact on family relationships. And how then emotional needs might not get met. And then we kind of move on to the next layer, which kind of looks at the community connections and what is the relationship with the family and the parents. Has family have they been experiencing any discrimination or oppression? What are their links to religious kind of institutions, or their access to hobbies and social groups, or also like their access to safe parks or, you know, greenery and stuff like that. So that all has an impact on your well-being. You got anything else to say, Jen?
Yeah, only that if you can start to think about all these different things and start to use this maybe model to think about it, and I'm sure lots of people are doing this already, think about it across those different layers, what you find then is that the solutions, if we think about just mental health as, you know, something that's wrong with us, then it obscures what the useful solutions, because if it's about what's happened to you, then you need to think about filling out the story of that. So doing what Kieran's just going through there, thinking about what are all the different things going on. But in thinking about all those different things that are going on, the solutions or the more appropriate solutions will come to you, or they'll become more obvious. Where often when we think, oh, this person needs counselling or this person needs to see a mental health professional, we obscure that and we miss some of the obvious things, like, does this person need secure housing? Do they need their housing needs met? Do they have enough food to eat on the table? Are they stressed out about that? Is there a lot of tension in the household and that's causing difficulties within the if there's parents or whomever the adults are, or the adult if they're on their own, and their external system, is that causing stress in that system, that's meaning that that parent isn't in the best place to then attend to their child's emotional needs because their emotional needs are unmet? And so then the solutions that we may need, that may both benefit people, can kind of be illuminated to us, if that makes sense. Anything else to add on that, Kieran?
No, someone's just put Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the chat, and
yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, these link to it, and we haven't covered it today, but also, if you're familiar, the trauma recovery model, where we need our basic needs met first. Therapy is right at the top. Engaging with mental health services or counselling is right at the top, because you need your basic needs met. You need to be out of threat. You need to have some security in relationships, some trust. You need to have a sense of belonging and connection with people, and have some stability there before you can move further up that, which we're going to come on to in a little bit. In the next couple of slides. The other thing just to say here is that, and I know this may feel obvious, but children don't live in isolation. So when we're looking at children, we're looking at, oh, well, why is this child, not able to concentrate? Why is this child wired and hyperactive? Or why is this child really withdrawn and quiet? What we tend to think about is those as the symptoms, or those are just like the things that we're observing of problems within a wider system, because children don't live in isolation. They live in this very messy, complicated context, and they've got lots of complicated circumstances around them. Just finally to say on the last bit on this point is that, so this is the World Health Organization's model for this, and model of understanding social determinants of mental health. So this is all our complicated policy stuff. But what happens then is, if we think about it as ACEs, adverse experiences, adverse events, they accumulate across the lifetime. And we can accumulate a negative course of this stuff across the lifetime. And it's this part here where children grow up and want to start their own families, when they enter the adult world, when they want to start building that for themselves. It's there that the inequalities get perpetuated, where inequity gets perpetuated, and so it's really important to intervene across the lifespan, but really important to intervene with families, but to work with the whole family, not just to see the problem within the child, but to think about things in context if we want to fix that. Anything else to add, Kieran?
no.
Do you want to?
Yeah, okay. So what impact can adversity and trauma have? So trauma tends to isolate people, and they become disconnected from self and others, and they tend to have negative self-beliefs and hold a lot of shame. So kind of beliefs like, I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, it's all my fault. And that kind of loss of safety and trust in others. So they experience the world and other people to be very dangerous and not safe. And emotional regulation can be a problem, and unhelpful survival strategies might develop, such as self-harm or being addicted to alcohol or drugs. So yeah, unhealthy coping mechanisms.
And I think it's helpful to think about, so we're talking about mental health as our circumstances, then what we see is intergenerational cycles and patterns of distress that occur across generations. And that's not to say, there's ever anybody's fault. Sometimes, it may have been a war, maybe even COVID, it's things like that that set families off on these trajectories. But if our mental health is about that, and it's about feeling like we have a place, and it's about feeling like we have access to power and resource and feeling connected, then it's really important to think about how these things are happening for a child, but also how as the wider adult network also thinking about this stuff, because those are the messages that are going to get passed on to children as well.
So if a parent is dysregulated, then they're going to find it really hard to be able to regulate their child's emotions. Yeah.
Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah. So this is really about what can we do about adversity and trauma recovery. And there's a brilliant book by Judith Herman, who is a psychiatrist based in America, and she talks about trauma being unfolded in 3 stages. And so stage number 1 is establishing safety, and that's what we've talked a lot about today in terms of stabilisation work. So shifting from danger, unpredictable danger, to reliable security and safety. And then kind of the next stage is processing, making sense, remembrance and mourning. And really this part is about kind of understanding your trauma memories, because trauma memories tend to be all over the place. So it's about trying to have a coherent narrative of the traumatic event, which is going to help then make sense of it. And then the third stage is about reconnection and moving forward. So like Jen was just saying, that trauma makes us feel like we're in isolation, and so moving forward is about that kind of social connection and having a kind of creating a new identity. The important thing about this kind of the 3 stages is that some people may only just kind of may never go beyond stage 1. So stage 1 is just about establishing safety and kind of learning the strategies to emotionally regulate, and learning how to cope with nightmares or flashbacks. So some people may just only stay in that stage. Some people may have a break from stage 1 before they do stage 2. But it's really up to the individual and their choice really about where they're at. But today we're gonna focus. We're gonna do a whistle-stop tour on all of it, really, aren't we?
Yeah, we're just going to give you some ideas to think about in either noticing where the people you're working with are at, or some things that you can do to help them go through a little bit of this. So in thinking about stabilisation and thinking about creating safety, is also important. Let me come on to this in the second slide.
Yeah.
It's also important, or actually no, that's the making sense of things part. Sorry, I'm going to stick with stabilisation first. Sorry. So in the things we need to do in order to, well, actually stabilisation is a bit of a jargon word in itself. What we mean is like bringing the body down and being regulated. Because our systems are interconnected, our emotions and our bodies are interconnected, they run off the same circuits. So our central nervous system is processing our physical pain as much as and it also processes our social pain. And so what's happening to us emotionally in our mental health gets stored in the body. And anxiety and depression are both tools to help us escape from our environments. So they require the body. You know, your heart races, your stomach goes into butterflies, your muscles tense, all those things. So the first part is being able to recognize those states, but then also regrounding and reconnecting and understanding what impact it's having on you physically, and finding ways that suit you to do that. So for some people that will be sitting in a room maybe with a cuppa and having a nice bath, and that's what does it for them. For others, those things may not feel safe or useful, and so they may want to be doing movement or exercise or sport, and you're working with them where they're at, if that makes sense. Kieran, do you want to add anything to that?
Just that, you know, I suppose stabilisation is about education, isn't it? About trauma and its effects and learning how to cope with the effects. So I always think knowledge is power. So in this, you're asking the person to try and relate to the literature and see where, you know, their kind of what their trauma looks like. Some trauma is around, like Jen said, about body memories. It could be a certain smell, or it could be, you know, a certain time of the day or whatever. So it's about trying to tailor it to the person that you're working with.
And the other thing to say here is about the use of the word trauma, I think, Kieran, because trauma is not necessarily like trauma is not a very useful word in communicating distress, and everybody understands it a bit different. Some people think, oh, that must be a childhood sexual abuse, that must be something horrific and awful that's happened to me. But trauma can equally be things that just cause you to disconnect from yourself and disconnect from who you are. And in that sense, I think we could think about COVID as a kind of trauma, because it has disconnected us. And for lots of us, we may have the resilience to bounce back from that, and it's fine. We don't need to, you know, we can go through that stage one quite easily, and we'll come out of that. But for others, we won't. It will cause more of a disconnection, and it'll take us longer to kind of come back to that, reestablish our place and our sense of self, and all of those things. So yeah, just a nod to the inconvenient use of that word, and to be mindful that it's events, so distressing events that are interpreted by that individual to be distressing to them, if that makes sense. So yeah, oh, if I missed one. Oh no, I'm reading the slides the wrong way, sorry. So when we're talking about people that are presenting with some kind of distress, we're not asking you to go in and then find out and think about all the horrible things that have happened to them. This is not about going and doing that kind of work, and people may not want to do that kind of work. It may not even be good for them. Like Kieran said, some people don't reach that stage where they need to go and do that. But what we are talking about is where people have had distress or some kind of distressing experience in their life, that in our work with them, we're giving them time and space to talk about that at their own pace, and that you're spending time thinking about how does that make them feel and what is the emotion that's come with that. So whether that's anxiety or depression or shame or whatever it is, you're not thinking so much about the events and getting caught up in that, but thinking and focusing more on the feelings of that. And in this kind of work, we're talking about reassuring people that what they're then feeling is normal, and it's normal to have lots of different reactions and lots of different feelings to things that have caused you disadvantage or adversity or have been traumatic to you. Often people, when they have these things, they try and minimize them. When you've had distress, you've had something that's gone wrong, people try to minimize it, they try to shut it out, and they try to get rid of it because it's difficult. They may not feel comfortable with that, but also just socially, we just tend to do that. So it's really important when somebody's presenting with distress that you also normalize and you also validate, and you don't minimize what they're saying. Or like, it could be worse. Oh yeah, we could be in lockdown for a year. Oh, it could be worse. Not kind of doing that thing, because that causes disconnection. And the aim of sitting and listening and helping somebody with distress is that you're helping them reconnect. So you're wanting to help them feel reconnected, and you can only do that through validating, and hearing and witnessing and being with them in that. Just also to remember that some people may not want to be touched, and so to be mindful of that. And they may be jumpy, so just be mindful of how somebody may be presenting and how their distress might be playing out in their body. Anything to add, Kieran?
No, I think you've said it all. I think it's about being with, isn't it? Being with and sitting with. And I think sometimes as humans, we want to fix things and make things better. And in that, we sometimes minimize what's happening. So it's about trying to just sit and tolerate that kind of feeling or distress that person is experiencing.
Cool. Did you want to say anything to this one, Kieran?
So in the PowerPoint right at the end, there's some resources to some stabilisation packs that Wales, CumTAF has come out with one, which is a stabilisation pack, and then there's this one as well. And we just thought we'd share them with you just in case you would like to use them in your practice. But we use them in our practice to work through with parents and young people. We sometimes sit with them and discuss how it applies to them. You don't have to use the whole pack, you can just use certain chapters of it, and it's all online, so it's really easily accessible. So yeah, I just wanted to let you know that that resource is out there for people to use.
And it's designed to be self-help. So although there's additional training you can get for this to help build confidence in using this kind of work, it is designed to be self-help. And so anybody can use it, and you can give it to people to work through themselves. When we talk about the like psychosocial education, or we talk about giving people the right information, we're pretty much talking about all the things we spoke about in the beginning. So it's about understanding distress and how distress impacts the body, and how it's about what's happened to you and not what's wrong with you. It's about what we're talking to there is about giving people that kind of information, if that makes sense. Anything else on that one, Kieran?
No.
Cool. Do you want
so I think we've talked about stage 1, haven't we, which is that establishing safety, and I think this is moving on to that kind of stage 2, kind of making sense of things. And we've talked a lot about how having good mental health relies on a story that makes sense to us, and if people have experienced kind of adversity or trauma, we know that has an impact on our story and on our memories. So knowing your story is really helpful for that sense of belonging, which we know is really important for mental health and for our well-being, but also being able to provide context to our choices and our behaviours, and thinking a little bit about what stories we tell ourselves. Anything that you wanted to add, Jen?
Yeah, just to recognise that if you've been through distressing or adverse experiences, traumatic experiences, when you feel so overwhelmed, you get a bit confused and you're a bit overloaded, and so you may forget things. If you've got a life of ACEs or chronic distress in your life for a prolonged period of time, there's going to be large chunks of your life where you may have that feeling of like, oh my God, I can't remember, I don't know what's going on, I don't remember doing that. And so then your sense of self and your sense of story gets disrupted. That's what we're talking about here, is that especially kids, because kids, they're learning how to understand the world and learning how to do abstract thinking and all of that stuff. And so 2 and 2 can equal an elephant. So it's important with kids to just check in and make sure that they've really understood what's happening, and that they're not, and if we're not having those conversations with kids, that they're not then doing what Kieran just said about filling in the blanks themselves, and catastrophizing, and not and taking on unhelpful information, and also internalizing that information as something about them. So, for example, there's a domestic violence situation, and the couple split up, but a conversation around that isn't had, and so then the child thinks, oh my God, my behaviour's made X parent leave, or what if I can make the other parent leave? And so children can get themselves tripped up, but I think we can do that as adults as well. And so what we're talking to when we're making sense of our story is really spending time and thinking about that, and where there's a negative story, thinking about how can we tap into where the positive things are, and how can we thicken out those positive narratives. And it's important to pay attention to this, because we like comfortable stories, we like familiar stories, because we like what's, familiarity feels safe. And so when you're thinking with someone about their story, you may get a lot of rejection of a new story. So you might, if you're working with a parent, for example, you may say, but you're a brilliant parent, I've seen you be a brilliant parent, you did that great thing last week, and they may minimize or deny that. And so just because of the way our brains are designed, we prefer comfort. So it's not that you give up on that parent, but you just keep persisting and keep gently helping them understand, and keep repeating that, so that they can start to trust that alternative story and build that into their then understanding of themselves. Anything you want to add, Kieran?
Just quickly, I think a lot of families that we work with have problem saturated stories, and find it really difficult to find that alternative story or that alternative way of thinking. And I see a lot of our work trying to build that alternative story for them.
That moves on to our next point, because what we've been saying is, if mental health is about your circumstances, and you have a lot of negative circumstances, you end up viewing yourself very negatively. You internalize those negative beliefs. And what's different from understanding the social determinants of health versus the social determinants of mental health is our access to power and our access to social status and things like that. So in these stories where there's lots of problem, there's usually lots of negativity. So the next part we wanted to focus on was just talking about power and how do we introduce power into people's stories, but also how do we help people make sense of their stories in relationship to that. So in psychology, the power threat meaning framework was constructed. It's very new. In 2018 this framework came out, and it's come out as an alternative way of understanding distress, so an alternative to diagnosis and a disorder way of thinking about mental health. And it's a formulation based approach, which means it's making sense of your story and making sense of what's happened to you. So we're building on the things that we've just been saying. I don't know if you can recognize in the middle here where it says power. So how is power operating across your life? If you can think back to the models we showed you earlier, we were showing you how all those different things impact on somebody's self-belief or somebody's then mental health and how they think of themselves. So the first starting point is to think about how are those things across a person's life giving them power or taking away power. So it occurs across these domains. So in terms of their body, so if we think about racism here, but then economic, so think about access to money and things like that. Legal, so if we think about refugees or asylum seekers. Coercion, where people are exposed to violence, violent relationships, violent households. Social capital, so how has somebody been able to access education and how are they thinking about that? Relational power, which we'll come on to say a little bit more about in a bit, but we're social animals. We need to be in relationships with others. You know, we're born to be dependent on others, and so there's a cost to us in not having that. So there's a loss of power in not having a good caregiving experience, and then ideological power, which is about how are we perceiving if we're controlled in an environment. Kieran, do you want to say anything more about those?
No, someone's just put in this chat, is this Lucy Johnson? Yes, it is. Yes,
it is. Lucy Johnson and Boyle, this is her framework. And it's a creative clinical psychologist who's on Instagram who's created this diagram, if you're interested. So we've got a first question is to ask, to understand somebody's story, is how is power operating across their life? And then the second thing to focus on is how did that affect you? So what threat did it bring to you? Did it mean you had a lack of emotional safety? How did it mean you were maybe excluded or discriminated against? What was the kind of threat? Is there a physical threat to that? Is there a social threat to that? Is it evoking shame and all of those different things? The next important thing to think about is then what sense of that did you make? So what meaning did you internalize of that? I felt excluded and ashamed? And it may be that people don't. So some people can have what we might think of as traumatic experiences. They might experience an assault of some kind, but because of the way they interpreted that threat and the sense they made of it means that they're not stuck in a struggle with that. So it's really important to understand what sense that person in their own circumstances, in their own interpretation, what meaning they're making of it. So once you've explored with somebody what meaning they're making of it, then it's helpful to understand and think about, well, what did they do to survive that? What did they do to try and escape that threat and that meaning if they had a negative interpretation of that? And that response might be that they've learned to harm themselves to escape that distress, but it might mean that they've started gambling, or they're taking drugs, or they socially isolate, or they or even if it's like you're on your phone a lot to try and escape from those overwhelming feelings. So Facebook is a really good one for doing that, where you just numb out by flicking through. There's no all of those different behaviours, there's a spectrum of behaviours there that are all important to understanding somebody's response. And the next thing to think about is then, well, what strengths does this person have? Because what access to power do they have that they could make more of, or that you could help them build on? So that's in building connections, building solidarity, accessing skills and accessing support and things like that. And it's the sum of this together. We've put it a little bit like this because it's a little bit easier, I think, if you want to. It's a bit easier to think about in a written form like this as well. It's the sum of this together that makes somebody's story. So you're thinking about what's happened to them, how did it affect them, what sense did they make of it, what did they do to survive, and okay, what strengths do they have now that we can help re-narrative and reinterpret, or help them escape from and gain more power. Anything to add, Kieran?
No, thank you.
So the next part, we're just going to talk and go a little bit more, what are we doing for time? Go a little bit more into power. So how can we help people gain power, and how can we help improve their access to that? Well, power is about being able to obtain and secure advantages for yourself or others. Can we help people do that by helping them access the right benefits, or access the right housing, or access college, or access things like that? How can we help them do that, or access something for their kids? Power is also about being able to influence your environment and make sure you've got your own needs. So how can we hand over to control? How can we be led by the individual? How can we take into account what they want and be guided by them in terms of what they feel is important to them, rather than us as practitioners in the system? What's good for the system? What can the system offer? How can we do some of that? How can we be co-productive in the way that we're working with people? And power is about controlling the resources that other people want, need, and or fear. So how can we think about what's going on for somebody there, and how can we help re-establish their connection with that? So in summary, we're asking, yeah, what is your family's experience been of power? Anything to add, Kieran?
No, thanks.
So that's Smale's work. If anybody's interested, Smale's got some really good books on understanding power and power mapping, which I think we've put as a resource at the end. So in your role and thinking about the families that you're working with and the family as a whole, some of the sources of power that we often try and help people access and think about what's getting in the way of them accessing that and how can we help them do that, is secure early relationships, which we'll come on to in a little bit. Access to information and knowledge, as Kieran has already said. How do we help them build supportive networks that are inclusive of them so that they feel like they have belonging with their partners? How do we help re-establish good relationship with partners, or how do we remove people from that, where that's maybe being not a source of power that can't be resolved? And how do we do that across families and friends and other support networks? Where people don't have that, I think often sometimes that's our role, is to give that first instance or first experience of an alternative way of being in relationships and help people then find more positive ways of being in relationship with others. Understanding, accepting identity and belonging. Building on, sharing information about mental health. If people have internalized that it's something that's wrong with them, can we help them re-understand that this is not about them, this is about what's happened to them? And how do we help them then reintegrate into their communities or their societies or their networks around them? How do we help them build skills and abilities? How do we think about community practices and rituals? How do we help people be able to access those? So if they live in a predominantly white area, but they're from abroad, how do we help them find access to others that are doing those things, or that are doing things similar to them? I think this is equally true for families that get moved because there's a housing shortage. For example, this happens in Newport a lot. People get moved then outside of Newport into the extended valleys areas. They've got no connection with those areas or those people or the way of doing life at those places, so it can make people feel isolated and lonely. How can we think about that when we're doing planning for these things, and we're planning moves? Connecting to nature and being outside because of the connection with movement, but also we need to be in different spaces as well, and there's good evidence around being connected to nature is good for mental health, and then access to material resources as sources of power. Anything to add, Kieran?
I know we're going to talk a little bit more about secure early relationships, but just to say that secure early relationships based on kind of emotional and physical needs being met, and that can be in the context of just having one secure relationship, as in could be one primary caregiver or foster care adult, anyone. So as long as they have that kind of one trusted relationship.
And that can be anywhere, can't it? Like,
yeah, coach, a school teacher, even kind of mirroring that in your work as a family support worker. Yeah.
And what the evidence base is showing is that those relationships, although we won't see the outcome of that, even if you're just in someone's life very short period of time, if you've role modeled this, you've role modeled this kind of thinking that they have value and that you believe in them, it can have a profound impact on people across the lifetime.
And give them then more confidence to trust other people and then replicate that relationship with someone else.
So we just finally in the last, so we want to save some time for questions as well, so try not to eat up too much of the time we have, but just finally in relation to thinking about how do we help people access power, one of the really important ways and really powerful ways that we can do this is about being kind to ourselves. So generally, just in society and the way society is, we can not value and be kind to ourselves, but if you have had adversity and trauma and stuff as well, then it can be particularly hard because you've internalized negative beliefs about yourself. But one of the most powerful things you can do is find self-compassion and be kind to yourself. In the science behind compassion in Kirsten Neff's work, which she's got loads of YouTube videos you can Google if you want to know more about. In summary, she says there are 3 things that we need to do. Kieran, do you want to speak to this?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, just as what Jen was saying is that, you know, there are lots of mental health benefits of compassion. So there's lots out there in terms of research and how it has an effect on your kind of nervous system and neuro pathways in your brain. But yeah, Kirsten Neff, check her out on YouTube. She's really great. She's got lots of YouTube videos. But how she summarizes compassion is that there are 3 components of self-compassion. The first one is self-kindness. And I think this is one that we all really struggle with, because we tend to be able to have compassion for others, but find it more difficult to show compassion towards ourselves. And it's really important in terms of including ourselves in the compassion circle and treating ourselves the same as we would treat our friends. So like, for example, sometimes I think I speak to myself so harshly and judge myself so much that I wouldn't even ever dream of speaking like that to like anyone, but I do that to myself. So it's about how can we treat ourselves with the same kindness and concern as you would a good friend. And I think it's about that kind of allowing to be kind to yourself, which I think sometimes can be quite difficult. The second component is around recognizing our common humanity, our shared human experience. So how am I the same as others? And, you know, at the moment, we've got a common shared experience of COVID, haven't we? So what does that mean? What does that mean to us as being humans? You know, what does it mean in terms of the human condition? You know, it means that we're all imperfect. It means that we all suffer pain. It means that we all have some kind of distress. So it's trying to think a little bit about how are we all the same. The third component is mindfulness, and that's kind of acknowledging and validating suffering and giving compassion to that suffering. Because I think we can get so lost in being really critical and noticing harsh criticism. So it's about how can we bring ourselves back into just kind of the present moment and kind of validate that suffering. I know mindfulness is a bit of a tricky one, isn't it, Jen? Some people find mindfulness really difficult, but we were saying
I find mindfulness really difficult, and I find the stuff that goes around it really cringy. So, you know, it's not for everyone, but also the mainstream way of thinking about mindfulness is not for everyone. But what I've learned and what I take is that mindfulness is about not being in the future and not always like, oh, what am I going to do next, or being on my phone, absorbing myself in something else, but being present in and being able to connect with and be like part of whatever's happening around me. And you can achieve that through many ways, can't you? Like, you can achieve that through yoga and breathing if that's what you want to do, but you can also achieve it through, I think, sports. You know, if you're in a skate park, for example, to learn your trick, to land your trick, you have to be in the moment, thinking of just the thing and then executing it. And so there are different ways of starting to learn to do this stuff that you then may want to do and do as a practice by yourself, or you may just want to try and achieve it through other things that you've got in your life. What would you say, Kieran?
Yeah, just building on what you said, Jen, I think good mental health and well-being is about being in the present. When your mind is kind of looking at the past, you tend to feel quite low. And then when your mind is looking into the future, like what if this, what if that, then it's kind of, your brain is consumed of anxiety. So it's about trying to be in the present moment, and that can be through just mindful eating or walking, you know, everyday kind of things that you can focus your attention on.
Making sure you don't put your phone at the dinner table so that everybody can be in the same space at the same time, even things like that as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you want to speak to this one as well?
So so we were just talking a little bit about emotional regulation before, and Paul Gilbert is a psychologist who has kind of come up with this model, which is the 3-circle model, and talks about the 3 emotional regulation systems in our brains, and you know that we need all of these systems. We need the threat system. We need the threat system because it protects us about any kind of external threats. And we need the drive system because if we didn't have any drive, then we wouldn't be motivated to do anything or, you know, aspire to do things. We need our soothing system to help us feel connected, to soothe. Now, what happens with our tricky brains, because our brains are not like animals, for example, we have that kind of extra layer of cognition and trying that kind of extra layer of being able to worry about things and be able to kind of just constantly worry about things. So what this system is saying is that, you know, what happens is sometimes we have too much of a big threat system or too much of a big kind of drive system, but actually what we really want to do is try and make sure that all these systems are balanced for kind of good mental health and good well-being. But because of, you know, everyday stresses, or because of the things that we've been talking about, kind of like social inequalities, these systems get activated and then people are kind of living in their threat system or their drive system. So people with low mood, for example, might have a very low drive system, and their threat system may be really big and their soothing system may be really small. So the idea around this kind of model is really about how can we make sure that our systems are all kind of regulated, they're all the same size, and if you've noticed that you're in your threat system, how can we get into our soothing system and show that kind of compassion to ourselves?
And just alongside that, so this is building on so the soothe system is building on self-compassion. That's where self-compassion sits. And so what you often see, if people have had lots of adversity, they've had lots of negative experience or trauma in their lives, their soothe system will be really small then. So it's about, this is a useful analogy, I think, as well. Like, you can draw this out together, draw it for yourself, you can draw it with your family and whoever you're working with, and think about what sizes are those threat systems, how active, how inactive are they at the minute, noting down some of those threats, noting down some of the things that people do, if anything, to help soothe themselves, where they give themselves permission to be soothing as well. And you can start to put down stuff and populate those and start to think about, well, how can we thicken out that your soothe system? What's some of the thinking and negative thoughts that might get in the way of that, as a useful tool just to help bring people's awareness to what might be going on for them. And then in that awareness, you're helping them access a sense of power, because you're helping them access a sense of knowledge, and then maybe a bit of control over what's happening to them and why it's happening to them. Anything else, Kieran? So lastly, in terms of then, so we've been talking about helping adults, or you can think about older kids as well, and you can think about this stuff just for kids, younger kids, especially kids that have got language. We've been thinking about how can we support them to access power and understand their distress. Another really useful tool and model for thinking about understanding children's distress, but also helping parents to move away from it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you, is the secure base model, or the circle of security model. And do we have time? I'm not sure we've got time to play it, Kieran. It's a 4-minute video.
No.
Should we just...
Yeah, just to say that it'd be really great for people to view it outside of the webinar. It's on YouTube, it's really easily accessible, but this video really kind of shows the key concepts of this relationship model. This model isn't just you know, something that you use between parent-infant relationships. This is a model that can be transferred into lots of relationships across the lifespan. So it could be with your manager, it could be with your partner, it could be with your child, it could be with your sister, it could be with anyone. It's a relationship-based model.
And it's designed, it's like summarizes all the decades, all the PhDs worth of research into attachment into this nice, really simple 4-minute video. And there's some other content on their website if you want to go more into this. But basically, it's about attachment. You need your attachment figure, which is your secure base here, and all of us, children and adults, need support. We need the right conditions to go out into the world, to explore our world, to go off and do that. But then when things go wrong or our emotional cup is full, we need a secure base to come back and welcome us in. So this is your parent, your caregiver here. But equally, this could be a partner or a work organisation or whatever, or this, you know, the state, the systems that govern us. We need them to help protect us, to comfort us, to delight in us, but to help organise our feelings, which is what we were talking earlier about being with. So helping people understand what went wrong. We do this with babies all the time. And we'll just try and describe it really quickly, but please do watch the video. When we have an infant, and when you're parenting, you talk to them even though they don't have language, but you talk to them to help them make sense, to start to make sense of their emotions. And that's what organising your feelings is. So when something goes wrong, you're helping somebody come in and you're saying things like, oh, I wonder if that was because this happened and that made you feel like this, and so now you're upset about that. And so you're helping people connect the emotion they're feeling with the experience that they're having, and in that you're being alongside them in their emotion, driving and creating connection and understanding and a sense of belonging in that as well. And for lots of parents that have had difficult upbringings, or maybe your parents just didn't do this stuff, or whatever's gone wrong, this model and understanding this model can be quite powerful, because it helps parents understand it's not about them. There is a easier way of understanding their children's distress, and it can help them move away from shame, and the shame they may sometimes experience when things aren't going quite right, if that makes sense. Anything to add, Kieran?
No, just that, that organising my feelings is that feeling that that child really thinks that, oh, you really get me, you really get what I'm saying. And I think it requires a lot of storytelling and narrative, doesn't it? So I'm guessing you're feeling angry because this happened or whatever. So it's kind of providing that kind of narrative, isn't it?
Yeah, going back to what we were saying about sense making. earlier, and the importance of that. It's as important for children as it is for adults as well, and this is a really good model. Is somebody stuck out on the circle? Do they need welcoming in, or is somebody stuck in on the circle? And that usually looks like anxiety. So a child that doesn't want to leave your side, a child that's being clingy to you and won't let go. How can we support them to feel safe and that the world is not scary, that the world is okay? How do we help them do that? Or for when kids are stuck out, maybe they're angry or they're quiet and withdrawn as well. How do we help bring them back in and socially connect them? Anything else on that? True.
I think somebody in the chat just put connection before correction, and that is absolutely what we're talking about. And you know, we need to connect when the brain is in fight or flight. There's no point adding logic or reason. So we really do need to connect with the feeling, and when that person has physiologically kind of calmed down and you can see that, that's when you do the correction. So I think a lot of families that we work with sometimes are pushing, so they're not sitting with the feeling and they're pushing for their child to be okay on the top, but actually it's about being able to sit and be with and tolerate that feeling or need in the circle.
And there's a great video that you can access called Shark Music, which articulates very well how adults' discomfort with an emotion drives disconnection. So how our own fear of an emotion or our own negative experience of that causes disconnection and then causes children to feel isolated. So I definitely recommend looking at that one as well. But just finally, Kieran, did you want to say about this?
So we're just thinking about the third stage, really, about kind of reconnection and moving forward. And I really like this quote from Gabor Mate, which is, the essence of trauma is a disconnect from the self. Therefore, the essence of healing is not just uncovering one's past, but reconnecting with oneself in the present. I think this is really important. I think this is what this means to me then, is that that kind of recovering from adverse circumstances or trauma is based on the empowerment of the family and the creation of new connections then. So recovery can only take place within the context of relationships. It can't occur in isolation. I think that's what I really take from this.
We put some resources, which we'll send out the slides so you can have access to these, but we've put some links there of things we've been talking about, and just a few of the references as well for your information. But that's all from us.
Oh, thank you so much, Jen and Kira. That was a fantastic presentation. You know, it was both massively informative, giving us loads and loads of things to think about. And obviously I'm going to go away and look at some of those things, as I'm sure other people are. But also what we particularly wanted from the webinar was it was practical as well. And absolutely, I feel like there's definitely something that I could take away from that, and I'm hoping others can as well. So that's just been brilliant, exactly what we asked for. So well done for that. Now we've got a few questions. Feel free, if anybody else has got any sort of questions they want to ask, put them in the chat. But I've got a few that came through during the presentation. So I'm just going to read some of those out to you now. The first one that came in was quite early on, and it talks about things like bipolar and schizophrenia. Are these brought on by what happens to you then, or is it something which is inherently wrong?
Ooh, inherently wrong. So I guess the way we would explain that, and actually if you look on our links, there's a document that the BPS has written called Understanding Schizophrenia and Psychosis. So that link will come out. And what the evidence base is showing and what practice is showing is that whilst there aren't genes for these things, what we have found is that epigenetics plays a part. And we don't have time to go into epigenetics, but please Google epigenetics. But in short, what epigenetics shows us is that there are so for example, my adverse environmental experience has an impact on my body, is what we've been saying, and it can alter I'm not a geneticist, so I just talk about this, the peripheries of the genes, like the fluffy bits on the outside. That's my technical term. They get altered, and it's those that get altered that can get passed on down generations. And the research on this is pretty new, but I've seen stuff that says that can get passed on for 3 to 5 generations. And so what looks like a genetic passing down is actually originally caused by environment. And that could be I've been in war or had some really serious thing that's not an inter-family issue, if that makes sense, but it's that catalyst of events that then over time, with lots of different environmental interactions of the social determinants of mental health, can lead to chronic distress and chronic physical adaptations, and then people can then, as a result, hear voices or have experiences. There's lots of great work by the Hearing Voices Network that can explain this stuff across, that you can see it across the continuum. So we all have bits of this, bits of like hearing things or seeing things or those experiences on a lower level, and so it's not, then it wouldn't be unusual to think that actually the extreme end of that is an accumulation of that, if that makes sense, if that answers the question as well. Anything to add, Kieran?
No, I mean, I think a lot of people talk about the biopsychosocial model, but in recent times we've been trying to think about it in terms of the social psycho-bio.
There's psychosocial ecological model, which we clearly need to work on because it doesn't roll off the tongue, but the psychosocial elements that then fit across your ecology, so your environment and how the interactions with them, isn't it? Yeah. So reframing that. Biology is definitely in there, but how we understand that isn't fully understood yet as well. Like, we're still learning more about how genes get altered and things.
Well, the person that asked it says thank you, so I'm assuming that they feel happy with the answer, so thank you for that one. There's a very practical question came in about the stabilisation packs. Are they available in different languages and in easy read and visual formats?
Yeah, so the World Health Organization has a visual one that's a bit more accessible. I don't know the answer to the translations question.
I do for the for the CUMTAF stabilisation pack, which is online. That's in easy read and in Welsh, and I think they have started to translate it in other languages as well.
It's a Welsh government document, the other one we showed you. So yeah, if it isn't, and you'd like that, if you could let us know, and then we can pass that back. If there are specific languages as well that you think would be useful, please let us know, and we can make sure that gets fed back.
Thank you very much. The last couple of questions I had, they're sort of linked, I think, so I'm going to put them both to you as one. So it's talking about what are those barriers that are there that people have to being kind to themselves. So when people are dealing with big issues or they're going through a crisis situation, sometimes they have, and it's absolutely true, less energy or time or that mental headspace to actually give to that self-care or exercise or self-compassion, all the things you talked about. So what people are asking is, what are the suggestions to sort of overcome this? How can people work with individuals to help them find that time and actually the headspace to be able to complete those self-care things?
Do you want to take it? Do you want to do?
Should we do it together?
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. You know, especially in the times that we're living in now, in terms of COVID, where you're working and at home, and your home is it's a space for everything, isn't it? So it is really difficult to tap into those kind of compassionate ways of being. I think it's about trying to encourage families to think about how they might be able to do this as a daily practice for themselves and as a family together, and you know, incorporating it as a daily routine is what we've been trying to think about, you know, coming up with kind of compassionate boxes, coping kit boxes. You know, when you're feeling really distressed, how can we kind of get into a different space? That might be through movement, and it doesn't have to be exercise, going around, you know, to the gym or anything like that. It could just be, you know, jogging on the spot or using a skipping rope, and we know that really helps with emotional regulation, some kind of movement. So I think it's
and alongside that, thinking about fight, flight and freeze. So there's a model, polyvagal theory, which the theory doesn't hold up itself, but there are parts of that do, and the parts that are useful are the understanding of fight, flight and freeze. So our systems are designed to react environmentally to saber-toothed tigers, lions and tigers and bears, and that's fight and flight. But when we're in fight and flight too long, we tip into freeze, which is like the possum effect, you know, the animal plays dead. So these systems are across all animals. But if you're noticing a family that's overwhelmed, if maybe they've hit freeze, and when you're in freeze, you have less motivation and hope and things like that. So it's about how do you help people come out of that freeze state? How do you help people come down from being overwhelmed? And lots of that, I think, is going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the trauma recovery model as well, which you can Google. And it's about establishing safety and establishing connection first. So establishing a rapport as a worker with them and gaining their trust, and helping them have some belief in you, that you believe in them, and then going along with them. How can you build in these little things? How can you get them, if you're like me, to buy into that? Yes, the breathing is going to help you, but it's only through relationship that I think you can start to do that. But remembering that freeze state will be about circumstances. So what are you noticing of their circumstances that could be changed, that could help bring down some of that distress as well at the same time?
But also, I think that we live in a society that we want a quick fix, and this isn't a quick fix. Like, you've got to practice it every day for it to make a difference. So sometimes it's about doing it and the motivation comes afterwards. So it's about trying to get them to understand that as well. It's like, you know, when I get up, I don't want to necessarily get up and go to the gym. I want to stay in my bed. But I know that if I make myself go, then the motivation comes afterwards and I reap the benefits afterwards. It's a bit like that, really, isn't it?
It's tricky. It is very tricky. It's not easy work.
No.
And it's about keep trying and keep finding different ways. Maybe one way doesn't work, try another way. Maybe you need a conversation, maybe you need a little bit more psychoeducation stuff in there to help people understand why they're feeling that way. There is if you Google polyvagal theory, up at the spelling, polyvagal theory, there's a model, so there's some visuals that you can use as well to help people start to understand, and then to do exactly what Kieran said. If they can hold on to that cognitively, they can go with the plan, not the mood, then they can maybe see some of the benefits from trying it. But you've got to be people's trust first to do that.
Thank you. Well, I was going to ask a question. I'm just going to see, I think another one's just come in. Do you think emotional regulation should be taught to children from reception age?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what the problem is that, we as parents and carers and teachers need to help children understand their internal world. And I think that schools think that they do that through PSHE and circle time and stuff like that. But actually, to build that emotional literacy, we need to have that language incorporated in everything that we do on a daily basis. And so that's why things like Circle of Security is really great, because organising your feelings, you are tapping into that emotional literacy and you're helping your child understand their feelings, and that feelings are normal. So when you feel angry, that's not a bad emotion. There are no bad emotions and good emotions. Emotions, they're normal and we feel them. So it's about trying to give them that kind of, baseline of information about their emotional literacy, which is really important. So absolutely, I think there needs to be more done in the school setting as well as, in the home setting about being able to,
and in nursery settings as well. I'd say it's they're really good ideas to have in nursery settings to create attachment informed, trauma informed settings right from the go. Really, the trick is that there's a lag. So in our services, not everybody works in this way. So these ideas, although they've been in the literature for, 50 years, I think, the attachment ideas have been around for a long time. Getting them to take hold is hard, and to even in our services, not everybody's working in this way. So if we can get this stuff in earlier, I think there's some training we need to do around us understanding this, because this is new stuff for us. This is stuff that we've been learning in the latter part of our adult lives, and that's, there's going to be a big adjustment in how we support parents and workers to understand, and then deal with the consequences of that sometimes as well, and sometimes the feelings of guilt that can come with that. But yeah, absolutely should be in everywhere, and in offices and in politics as well. Yeah. The government needs to be thinking about relational ways of providing these contexts too.
Thank you. There's a couple more. I think we can probably fit in another question, I think. So someone has asked about training on circle of security. I think we can answer that after, because there is training available on that.
Right. And there's a classroom-based version as well. So there's some different models.
Do you find that people try to shelter children from some experiences, often at their detrimental long-term?
Yeah, I think what we often come across is that people feel when they're going to talk about emotions, they're going to open a can of worms, and then what do I do with that can of worms once I've opened it? Or that children aren't equipped or able to handle stuff, so we just don't tell them. We don't tell them maybe so-and-so's died, or so-and-so's broken up, or the reasons why maybe something's changing. And that then has an impact on children's coherent stories and the sense that they can make of things. And so not always, but I think, yeah, there can be detrimental impacts.
I mean, as adults, we lie a lot to children, don't we, about the tooth fairy, Santa, everything. So actually, as again, knowledge is power. So when we come to things like, you know, emotions or your story, belonging, identity, all of those things, it's really important to be able to be truthful about those. I think a lot of what I see in practice is family secrets. So secrets about who your dad is, who your biological dad is, and all of that kind of stuff. And that has a massive detrimental impact on the family and a psychological burden on that young person. So going back to the story, it's really important to know your story and where you've come from.
I think that's a particularly important question for children in foster care or who've had multiple placements, who are then in adoption. Being able to have a coherent narrative is key to mental health.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'm sure all this is going to be even more relevant as we work in the families as they come out of the whole COVID pandemic. And as you rightly said, it is a trauma, and everyone has felt it in a different way, haven't they? And it's going to be this, you know, more of this. We're going to need more information on this to support families going forward. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to pop a little short poll in the chat function. So if everybody does have a chance just to give us a little bit of feedback, both for Children in Wales and for Jen and Ciara themselves, so just to get an idea of how the webinar has been for everybody. Although judging the comments, there's been lots and lots of positive comments, which I think we can judge for ourselves. Everybody has thoroughly enjoyed it and got a lot from it, and a lot more to do to take away and read and look at lots of different videos. As Louise has put in the chat, we will send the slides around, we'll send all the links, and if there's anything else you want us to share, we're more happy to do that. Jen, you can pass it on to us and we can share that with the group. But yes, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure.
Great.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming today, and take care.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for your feedback as well.
Yeah, thank you.